James Watkins. I think I've got about 20 minutes here, or 2 hours. I try to paint a picture of the person in his setting than in a way the other way around. Because KaritANE has given us a lot of setting already. Watkins was born in Manchester in 1805, when Manchester was hardly more than a big town. But the cotton industry had started, and his father was typical of thousands of immigrants because he was Welsh. Father was a cotton spinner. Died when I think James was 5 or 6 or 7. His stepfather, was a merchant. And the difference is important because I think it is evident to me as I read his story. Inside his story, he was middle class, not working class. And that makes a difference to the way one thinks about the world. Manchester, as I said, new industrial city, based on cotton as much as anything, and therefore based on slavery. A centre for working class people, because they worked in these vast mills, the dark satanic mills of William Blake. And it was out of Manchester as much as anything that working class movements started. By the time Watkins had come to New Zealand, something called the Chartist movement was well established, a really important transformational way of thinking about the stature of labour at its worth, their self-assurance and their search for rights. For whatever reason, and I suspect it has to do with the aspirations of somebody who's middle class, Watkins had an extreme sense of the importance of education. Just a block or two away from where he lived was both a Wesleyan church, but also what was called the Great Bridgewater Street Sunday School. It was a denominational Sunday school, which eventually was taken over by the Wesleyans, but it was huge. And it provided a non-denominational education, because that's what the Sunday schools did. They were the means of education for a whole class of people who had no chance of going to a private school. So he spent his formative years, probably until he was 15 at least, at that school. If he worked, well, of course he worked, but I'm not absolutely sure what he did, except maybe that he was a warehouseman. Well, that's on the fringes of not industry, but office work. He was clearly a good student then, stayed on after his time as a pupil in the Sunday school to be a Sunday school teacher, and then in the mid-20s, when he was about 20, started to be a local preacher. That was the first rung of the ladder, and may indicate, though he doesn't say so, that he had ideas of being a minister from the time he was maybe a late teenager. He was, for his time, well educated, extremely well read. There's a nice saying about, a nice story about him from his time in Wellington. That was after he had been here. He spent 10 years in Wellington and set up almost the first day school in Wellington, or at least the Wesleyans did, and he was its president. He went to the school as the president should, most days, and on one day the teacher said, "Did you hear that the French government had been overthrown?" This is 1848, time of revolution, the year of revolutions. So Watkins gave an impromptu address to the kids at the school for an hour on the history of France leading up to the revolution. He was like that. And the same Samuel Ironside, his colleague there, said in later life he was the best informed man I ever knew. Now, that's high praise. That's the man who then, in the late 20s, about 1827, maybe 1828, not quite clear, decided to offer for the ministry. Was given a sort of reasonably favourable look over, but there was no job for him. And then in that year, he probably, I can imagine, however, while continuing work, probably did more work as a local preacher. He does talk about going all over the outer hills of Manchester to preach in little chapels here and there. So he was then, that's right, and in that next year, he didn't offer for the general ministry, he offered for missionary work. He wanted to go to Sweden, of all places. I didn't know that Sweden needed to be missioned, but the Wesleyans presumably thought so. But that didn't happen. He went up to London in 1828 and was interviewed by the missionary committee, which was made up of some pretty fearsome men. He named one of his sons after one of them, Jabez Bunting, who was the arch administrator. And arch, I think, is a good word, actually. He was tested, but again, there was no opening for him as a missionary. But there was in 1829. So he went through the various routines late in 1829 in order to set out as a missionary. One of them meant marrying, and he married a lady called Hannah Entwistle. Her father and family were part of the church that he had gone to, the chapel in Manchester. Her uncle, Joseph Entwistle, was, along with this guy, Jabez Bunting, one of the 2 or 3 most prominent leaders of the Methodist Church in England at the time. So Watkins could claim to be, and this is a good idea actually, well connected. When he went finally to, and was appointed to, the Tonga, Friendly Islands as they were known then. The trouble about going to the Friendly Islands is there wasn't any regular shipping service. So they caught a passing whaler, you might say, a boat called the Lloyd, right at the very beginning of 1830. And they were going to go on an extensive whaling expedition in the South Pacific. But Watkins wasn't the only person going. There were 3 or 4 other ministers and their wives, their new wives, all going at the same time, on a boat that was inclined, if the skipper thought he saw a whale, stop and chase the whale rather than head on to the South Pacific. Eventually they reached the New Zealand, because that's where you set out to go whaling, and in early March they arrived, I think let's say early March, and they stayed for 6 weeks in northern New Zealand while the whaler went whaling. Now it's important to note this because there was, of course, at that time a fairly newly established Methodist mission in the Hokianga at a place called Mangungu. So they spent there 6 weeks, or maybe 7, living there, waiting to be told that the boat had come back for them. And clearly, Watkins set about understanding Maori. He was not going to use it because he was going off to Tonga, but he was of a linguistic frame of mind, I think. I'll come back to that. But he learned so much Maori and retained such a memory of it that when he came to the South Island, he couldn't really understand what they talked. He couldn't understand the Kaitahu dialect. He recognised that it was so different. And that was therefore one of the very first things he did was to set about putting together worship resources and reading resources in Kaitahu, not in normal te reo. The the Church Missionary Society, Anglican Press in Paihia, were busy printing hymn books and prayer books and that sort of thing. But when the tangata whenua, the Maori down here, first came across these, they couldn't understand what the book said. For them, the difference between northern and southern Maori, te reo, was so obvious or so extreme that it was like almost learning a new language. So that's an aside, but that was the result of just 6 weeks in Hokianga. An awareness that Maori, I came to an awareness later that Maori was not one language. There were variations and significant variations in the language. Came to Tonga, spent time in Nuku'alofa and the big island in the south, then was sent to a place called Ha'apai. Those are the mountains those are the group of islands to the sort of northwest. In our own minds this year, because that's where the big eruption took place. That was one of his islands that he used to very occasionally not want to visit. He didn't like going in open boats, and that's all there was around Tonga. So he spent 7 years, 1837 he finished in Tonga, moving around. There was at that time a change of dynamic in the ruling of the country. They were certainly an associated group of islands with Nuku'alofa, Ha'apai, and particularly Vavao in the north. That was where the former king resided. He had come to the end of his life and had sort of stepped down, and his nephew, a man called Taufa Aho, was the candidate to take over as the king. That was not a popular choice with the Tongan brothers and sisters in the south, and it turned into quite a severe civil war in 1835, 1836. The Wesleyans, because they had pinned their colours to Taufa Aho's mast, could hardly stay objective about it. And they became pretty warlike in their reporting, to the point where they were rebuked strongly by the office in London about being too, I suppose we would say, political. But the battle was finally won after a good deal of bloodshed, and Watkins and his family himself, because they were in the big island of Nuku'alofa at that time, they hardly said that they escaped by the skin of their teeth, but there were people being killed outside their front door. So it had settled down, and the Methodist Church, or the Wesleyan Church as it was really then, the Wesleyan Mission, became, so far as the new king was concerned, the official church. And so it remained, and I think we need to just step into the present day. There are, in fact, two Methodist churches in Tonga. There is the Free Methodist Church, which is by far the largest, which is the church of the king, the present king, of his father and of somebody that we all might remember from our childhood, Queen Salote. Queen Salote was Tupu, King Tupu the First's granddaughter, I think. Granddaughter, maybe. I remember her. Did any of you remember seeing her? I saw her at the coronation in London, sitting in an open carriage with a poor sultan from Malaysia who wanted to have the cover over because it was raining. And Queen Salote wasn't going to have a bar of the cover being over her in the presence of her queen. Just a story, but the Methodist angle to Tonga is quite significant, And we still have the Free Church, and there still is a Wesleyan Church of Tonga, much smaller, quarter of the size, something like that. There's toing and froing, but they're proud people. That's the Tonga that he left. He came to Sydney, did Watkins with his family of 5 children, I think, at that stage, settled in Sydney and was welcomed because they were pretty short of staff and there was plenty for him to do. He didn't like being there. He thought it would be better to go back to England, but they weren't going to pay his fare. So he stayed around until, as Hinerangi has mentioned, firstly, chiefs from this part of the South Island came to the mission's head of mission in the Wesleyan mission in Sydney to ask whether there could be a missionary sent. There wasn't anybody to send. Well, not down here. They did want to send somebody to be the Minister for Te Rauparaha. And so on the station, what's called the stationing sheet, where all the names are listed annually, in 1839, Watkins is shown as the Minister for Kapiti. He would have been supposedly living on Kapiti Island, just north of Wellington. That didn't happen because now, coupled with the pleas that had been made by the chiefs Tuhawaiki, Taiaroa and KaritANE from Takao and elsewhere, Kaitahu, there was the voice of Johnny Jones, a whaler of prominence and a successful one. He'd started off as a boatman in Sydney, but he made his fortune, set himself up in the whaling industry, probably actively initially, and then buying out whalers until by 1837-38 he was one of the most prominent operating in the southern part of New Zealand. He had the idea not only of, as it were, building up his whaling station here at KaritANE, which then, by the way, was called Waikuaiti. That's how Watkins always refers to this place when he's referring back to his time as a missionary. So there was the prospect, first of all, of a whaling station being built here, and then Jones had the good idea that it would be cheaper to buy fresh food if it was farmed in Waikuaiti than shipped over from Sydney. So he chose, and the number varies, it's about 20 people, settlers in Sydney, to come over. He probably paid their fares and provided them with some establishment fees so that they could build a house or something like that. So the idea was that Watkins would not only come to the whaling station, but also to the settlers, to be the minister to the settlers. And in fact, Jones was prepared to give £50, which I would have thought was something like £500,000 for buying, not quite, but a lot of money in those days, to induce the Wesleyan mission in Sydney to send a missionary to here. So Watkins came. They sailed across the Tasman in late April, had one hell of a time in the Fofo Strait, nearly got wrecked, but eventually they landed here, and then of course they had to set about setting themselves up. That meant building a house and all that sort of thing, and all the time engaging in business, in the business of being a mission. And that's where I think I would say that Watkins was different from most of his contemporaries, I would think. One of my concerns when I hear people talking about Methodist mission history is that they idealise it, and it was all about saving souls, which was what John Wesley said. They had nothing else to do but save souls. You can't live day by day if you're only saving souls. And this caused quite a good deal of anger among among the missionaries themselves. There were practical people, there were impractical people. And I think the balance was in favour of the impractical at the start. So Watkins came to New Zealand with 10 years of history here, and he knew what he was going to do. And that was, as much as anything, educate. That's the key word, in a way, in his vocabulary. He doesn't use it a great deal, but he set out, and you can't educate unless you can speak the language of the people here. It's not a case of teaching them English and then they learn. It's a case of helping them to learn in their own language, and that's not easy. That means having an acute ear to hear the way words are said, an acute ear for idiom, for the stories that people tell, for the way they speak. And Watkins certainly had this linguistic skill. I'm at the age when I repeat myself. When later in his later on, let's say in the 70s, I think it was, a visitor to Tonga was talking with an elderly Tongan minister. In fact, I think he might have been the very first ever appointed by the mission. And he said, who of the old missionaries was the best linguist? And this guy said, James Watkins. I think that Watkins had, and the blessings on him for this, an ability to hear the spoken word and turn it into the written word. And so much of his time, both here in Waikouaiti and certainly in Wellington in respect to schooling, and that wasn't a mission station, but his ministry in New Zealand, that was until 1855, was very much involved in teaching. Let's say teaching the Maori in here and in Wellington, but also teaching the new settlers in Wellington. Now, how do you do that? How do you teach people to read when they don't have any books? Or when the books that they have aren't in your language? So that from almost the very beginning, it's hard to say, because I think that Watkins, whose diary I have read minutely, he puts everything into it. But one thing he doesn't tell you is that when he started teaching the language, I think he just assumes that that's the way things are done. So he preached within a day of arrival, but he preached in English. The local people, tangata whenua, were there, not understanding a word of it. That couldn't go on. So he spent the next 2 or 3 months, maybe 2 rather than 3, getting stuff together to go to a printer, to get a book done. Now the words sound good, don't they? You're in Waikouaiti, I'm going to get a book printed. Where do you go? Well, there's a Wesleyan missionary press up in the north of the North Island. How do you get there? Oh, we'll send it to Sydney instead, it's quicker. Literally, it was quicker to get stuff to Sydney. But Watkins didn't realise this immediately. So he prepared his book, sent it off to the mission station in Hokianga, which had its own printer, and the printer, in fact, a man called William Woon, had been one of Watkins' colleagues in Tonga. Woon wasn't the most, let's say, efficient person. And Watkins waited and waited and waited for some sort of a response. Finally, he also, and here I'm reading between the lines because I realise now that it's reading his diary, you don't quite know whether he's talking about the papers he sent off to Sydney or the papers he sent off to Hokianga. But about the in the end of the year, say, he was getting ready to share his written material with the classes that he had established here in Waikouaiti. And then, mercifully, the books came back from Hokianga. And I've got a book that I don't know whether any of you have read, put out by George Griffith's Press, Otago Heritage Books. This is that in the inside insert is a facsimile of the book that Watkins wrote. It's got 12 pages. On the back page are the 3 hymns that Colin has set to music. It's the only copy known, and it's in Alexander Timber Library. It's extraordinary because probably hundreds and hundreds of them were handed out. And think about it. What do you do with a book you learn from? You use it up. You use it so often that it falls to pieces. And I think that's very likely the reason why there's only one copy left that's known. So that book made it possible for a change to take place from the end of 1840 in the life of the mission, when there was a proper school. Now, Watkins didn't do this, and excuse me if it sounded like it, he did not do this all alone. He had to have help, and I'm just quickly looking for where I wrote it down, because I want to get the name correct. Tame, yeah, that's right. There was here a chief of considerable status, mana here, named Haereroa Tohati, known as Tame. He lived with Watkins' family. Tame's job was to, at the end of the peninsula here, he was the whale spotter. That was a skillful task. You had to read, know what you were doing. It was Tame who helped Watkins understand the language that he was learning himself to speak, and to understand it in such a way that he could write it down. So that the book itself is a pretty wonderful recreation of the language of that time, 1840, at a time when such books were hardly ever being printed. The translations that the Church Missionary Society used had been made as a result of work that a guy called Thomas Kendall had done in the 1820s, but it had all been done by linguists in England. The notes that he brought back had been turned into printed books on English presses rather than here. That didn't last. They had their big press at Waimate themselves. I want to finish just with a tribute to Watkins for the last event that we are celebrating here today. He comes on May the 13th or 17th or whatever, 13th to Waikouaiti, preaches in English, recognises that this is simply a waste of time. If he's going to reach his people, he's going to have a printed book. So he works at this for months, literally months, but within 4 months, he is able or confident enough in himself to say, I'm going to preach in Te Reo this Sunday. And this Sunday happened to be the 25th Sunday after Trinity, the Sunday at that time in the middle of September. And hear that word extempore, no notes. Wesleyan preachers didn't use notes. So if he was going to preach, he had to preach without notes, which meant that he had to know his te reo off by heart. And I think that in the space of 4 months, or a bit less, that's a pretty remarkable achievement. One has to have skills, of course, but I think one has to have, then we might say, an ear for a language to enable you to do this. And I would love to know what he preached about. He doesn't say. I thought I knew because there's a quotation. He quotes scripture, and it was after describing the reaction of the people there, one of surprise, sort of dawning understanding that, they can understand something about what this guy is saying. Then he puts a quotation in from scripture. It's from Acts 17:20. And I think he's putting these words appropriately into the mouth of his hearers. This is from the Acts. Some of the things you said seem startling to us, and we would like to find out what they mean. I think that's a brilliant little summary of the reaction of that congregation on that day. Don't want to say more. He spent 3-4 years here. And I did say that he didn't like travel. He really did not like, and the only way to get from here to the Otago Harbour was in a longboat. And for him, Manchester born, travelling in a longboat was never an ideal way of getting from A to B. In fact, he was considerably miffed that George Augustus Selwyn, the bishop, beat him to the south of New Zealand, and that Bishop Pompalia had beaten him to Otago Harbour. But he made his way there, and of course what he did, as he did everywhere, he found youngish men, often of chiefly caste and ability, who became his leaders, the people who he could talk with and who would do things with him and for him. There's a host of them. I hardly like to mention a name. One of the most constant was a man called Rawiri Tamaire. But they came from all over. These people came from all over Southland and Otago to be with Watkins, to be taught, and then to go out and be teachers themselves and to be leaders who were fluent in English as they were in Te Reo, and many of whom, this is important to say, many of whom who became leaders in the land question. These were the people who, because of their skill with words, were able to speak on behalf of their people in English in the courts of law. And that's a really precious part of the history of the time. These people outlasted him, and here's a final memory. I came across a reference many years ago in the papers of a man called Justice Chapman. He had gone visiting people here, as far as I know, and elsewhere, the elders of the tribe then, this is 1900, 60 years after the mission, to find out what their memories were. He had, I think, in his hand, a piece of paper with maybe a bit of a statement of history by one of these people who wasn't at the meeting. And Chapman said, who wrote this? I don't think he knew, but he wanted to know who might have written it. And they had an argument and decided it couldn't be one of Watkins' students because he didn't write like Watkins taught them. Watkins had a hand, and all the people he taught wrote like him with his hand. I like that memory. That makes it sort of real. that's the beginning of an understanding, I'm going to stop here, of how Watkins came to be. The rest of his history is quite quickly. He spent time in parish ministry in Sydney, briefly in Melbourne, was a president in its very earliest years of the Methodist Church of Australasia, died full of years in 1886. I think he was senior minister alive in the connection, and his whole family had visited him a month or two before. They'd come from all over the Pacific to be with him at the end of his life, which says a lot for James Watkins. Thank you. I'll answer a question if there is really one.
Just while they are assembling, just to clear up a misconception, in the little book with the text of the hymns, he didn't put any tunes down. He didn't write any music. He just put down what kind of measurement the hymns should be sung to. So my job really was to go to a contemporary Methodist hymnal, and he must certainly have known that to sing from, and find the sort of standard Methodist songs that were in use at the time that would have fitted his text. So we've got tunes that you'll know very, very well, especially the next one, which are simply the Methodist and Universal hymn tunes of the period that Watkins was writing for. I presume they did sing them, and I guess they sang them to those tunes or something like it. Okay. We're going to do number 2 and then we'll sing number 3. By the way, all of these texts were printed with an English version as well, which in the little book says by Mr. Marlowe, and I wondered who on earth Mr. Marlowe was, but Donald tells me it's a misprint and that's not surprising, for Mr. Harlow. Now, Mr. Harlow was a father of Ray Harlow, who turned up in the University of Otago. There's a wonderful coincidence here, and was introduced as the man who could teach Maori to the Maoris because he'd gone to Germany and learned the language there. So back he comes to Dunedin and teaches Maori to young students, and that's how he got to know Maori in the first place. And his grandfather is Mr. Harlow, who printed his text in the books. So our large
Is that the same Harlow that collected Kaitahi dialect?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah,
That's right.
that's the one.
Played at my wedding.
Okay, one more tune.